Are we good? All right. So we will jump in now to talking in more detail about each of the individual themes and an overview of what's covered in each of them, plus a bit, as I mentioned, to start with some research and background about why is this important. What's the research that supports this as being critical to incorporate into the program, and again, that these background and research things that we'll talk about are really important for you as facilitators aren't necessarily important for program participants, but really good for you to know about why these elements are incorporated, what the research suggests about what's happening developmentally in particular that makes these practices very important and what they support. So we are going to start with our first theme of be or body. And the theme is, listen, your body is trying to tell you something. And so the real focus is, let's listen to the messages from our body, which sometimes we are disconnected from. And so we're going to start by again, thinking about some of the grounding about why some of these things are important. So schools, but also parents and teams themselves, are often really interested in learning and achievement as outcomes. And we tend to assess these outcomes in very concrete and observable ways, what we would think of as products of learning. So test scores, essays, presentation, things that are easily seen in a parent, that we can have people demonstrate whether they have achieved or learned. But the how does learning happen, are often tools of learning that aren't as easily seen and are less apparent. So ability to stay on task, our ability to resist distractions, our ability to regulate our emotions, particularly if we're dealing with potentially unpleasant emotions, and our ability to be flexible and also shift our attention. And so these are commonly called executive functions, our ability to regulate our attention and our emotions in ways that then underlie learning and achievement. And so there are three main executive functions that you may be familiar with, but these are cognitive functions that make learning possible. And they make a lot of other things in our lives possible too, which is why they become so critical to what we do in learning to breathe and kind of underlying a lot of the practices that we engage in. So these three main families, first we think about working memory. So anybody feel like they have a good working definition of working memory that they share with the group? Back to intro psych, if anybody took it, or no brave volunteers? Does anybody remember the question I just asked you?
Ooh, that's a good one. Right.
Well, if you do, it's because you have working memory.
Yeah.
And so it's our ability to hold things in our mind as we think about them, as we manipulate them, as we use them to make decisions. So kind of what we are processing at the moment. And for some of us, we have more capacity for holding things in our working memory than others, and having more tends to be better. So cognitive flexibility then is our ability to be cognitively flexible, our ability to shift attention to what we're doing, particularly when distractions threaten us and try to derail cognitive processes. So if you think about a time that you've sat in an exam and you've really directed your attention towards that exam, when you could be listening to the clock tick, you could be listening to people shift, people breathing, your ability to kind of put your attention where you want it, shift your attention away from distractions towards what you want is an indicator of cognitive flexibility, and of course then it becomes clear how there's some benefits to be able to do that. And then inhibitory control is similar in some ways, our ability to notice and manage our own distractions, particularly in the ways it can affect our working memory. And so what we know is that as these functions improve, so as deficits in our working memory, poor impulse control, behavior problems, as those things decrease, we see benefits in important ways. So we see increases in school readiness, increases in prosocial behavior, and also academic performance. So it's important for us to be able to through our work to indirectly or directly improve executive function. Which leads to the question of, can mindfulness strengthen executive function? So it in many ways requires it. So these practices of focusing on the breath, and you may notice distractions and come back to it, that's an executive function that you're practicing. So it raises the question, can the practice of mindfulness make us better executive functioners? So we're going to talk about just one study that suggests yes, that mindfulness training does in fact improve executive function, or at least some elements of it. And so this is on one of those charts of study summaries. There was a study out of Penn State. This is a discussion of some of those results, which had a series of computerized executive function assessments. And so we'll talk just a little bit about what the tasks they did were and what they actually found. So they used a Stroop task. Has anybody done a Stroop task? Do you remember what you were asked to do?
If I could be mistaken, but I think is it kind of what's flashed on, okay.
Yeah, and so what,
Yeah, so essentially a word will flash, so it'll be a color, but it'll be in a different color than what it is. So again, so if like it's purple won't be in purple, it'll be in a different color, say red or yellow. So then you have to say the color that is written, not, the color that is written, not the color that it is.
Mm-hmm. And that, you can see how that would be, especially you're asked to do this quickly.
Yeah.
And so that you're dealing with interference, because our instinct is to say red, because it's in red. And so you need to manage your that interference to follow the instructions that you're given. And it would be challenging either way, but reading the word and not the color that it's printed in can be a real challenge. And so this was one task that they used. They also use something called an emotional NBAC. An NBAC is something that as many people have done. The idea is you're presented with stimuli and you have to remember something that happened before, and N is how many times before it happened. So like a 3-back would be you're remembering something that happened 3 trials ago. And so there are some, if you're ever wondering about your own executive function, there are some free NBAC games you can play, and you want your N number to be high. It can test like how far back you can go. And with an emotional NBAC, the idea is that emotional photos are presented interspersed with the stimuli, and so these emotion photos can interfere with memory. So emotion regulation is really required to override that emotional stimuli to pay attention to the thing that you're supposed to be remembering. And then the BART analog risk-taking, or the balloon analog risk-taking, or the BART task, is a measure of risk-taking and also how you balance risk and rewards. So it's a computerized game where you pump up a balloon, and the more you get it to pump up, the more points you get. But of course, probably most of us have experienced, if you pump a balloon up too high, it pops. And so if you pop the balloon, you lose all your rewards. So you need to kind of balance the risk of popping the balloon with the rewards. And we see people who overemphasize risks. There are some problems with that in terms of behavioral and emotion regulation. So popping the balloon too many times, too much emphasis on risk can be problematic. And so as a brief summary of what they found in terms of the mindfulness condition versus a control condition. First of all, they found that people in the mindfulness condition had increased attention to task, and this was less time needed to respond correctly to both congruent, and so this would be when words are, purple is printed in purple as opposed to printed in red, and then also incongruent task when purple is printed in red. So kind of better management of those, of that interference. Also increased resistance to these emotional distractions, so kind of fewer false alarms, better memory in this emotional NBAC task. And then also decreased risk-taking, so fewer balloon pumps, less emphasis on the risk, or the potential reward of more points over the risks of popping it. And so this was the mindfulness group versus the control group, and some evidence that those in the mindfulness condition did better in terms of these executive functioning tasks after the program. But what they also found were some interesting effects of high versus low practice. So you can do a mindfulness program and not practice 1 minute outside of class. And then you also can do quite a bit. And So they compared people who had done a lot of practice outside of the group and people who had not, and they found very similar benefits for people who did more practice. So people who practiced more had lower levels of problems with emotion regulation, lack of emotional awareness and clarity, impulse control difficulties, mind wandering, things like this. And also higher levels of social connectedness, kind of an indicator of that pro-social behavior that I'm talking about as one of the goals of Learning to Breathe. And these practice effects were not just because people at the beginning, or it wasn't that people who were at higher risk before starting the program practiced more. So that would be if practice and risk were confounded. They were not in fact confounded, so it really seemed to be something about practicing more was a benefit in terms of these outcomes. A few other things, the number of substance use consequences was lower for the high practice group, and having no substance use consequences was much more likely in the high practice group. So it's some indication that it's not just being in the mindfulness program, but it's also practicing. And underscore that in part here because of the attention that's paid at the end of each program to really talking about the ways, why it's important to engage in home practice as the program goes on, talking about challenges, sharing as a group what was hard for you to do these things and sharing what worked to really support people doing these things outside of the session. Yeah.
Is there any discussion about like how long those practices were on average?
I do not remember the answer to that question, but I can look it up and get back to you. This is a really cool study. And part of a growing literature about the importance of home practice. So different studies have defined it different way and often come to the same conclusion, but I don't remember what exactly that looks like. All right, so that's kind of the background about why do we do the things that we do in the B session? Why is it important? And really key is underlying, trying to increase abilities to engage in appropriate executive functions that then have all of these other benefits. So to talk then more detail about what happens in each of these programs, in the first meeting, of course, there's a similar structure to all of the other weeks, but there's some additional requirements because it's the first time that you're meeting together as a group. So a welcome and an overall introduction to the program is really important. Some groundwork, getting a sense for what people have heard about mindfulness. It's so much more popular now. They may have purchased Mindful Mayo, and so maybe have a good or maybe an accurate perception of what mindfulness actually is, but that can be helpful to engage in that discussion. And then kind of talking a little bit about what that general structure looks like, and really emphasizing each week that you're building to the overall goal of empowerment, that these individual themes and these individual practices build towards a goal of helping them to be better balanced and more empowered to deal with stressful and potentially unpleasant experiences. And then one of the really important parts of meeting together for the first time is establishing group guidelines, which is not uncommon anytime a new group forms. You probably experienced yourself with new classes, where you're going to be meeting for a semester, where there's some discussion about how are we going to engage as a group in a way that respects each other. So it can be really helpful to do this by having students generate ideas, and a nice way to connect it to, again, the idea that this is a student-led, discovery-guided program. This is not a teacher-led program, except when there's guidance and, again, creating these conditions. But starting that off with having students produce what these guidelines are can be really helpful. As a facilitator, though, it is also important to make sure that if students have not suggested some key guidelines, that you suggest one or two of them. A really important one being that if students choose not to do an individual practice, that's fine, but to respect that other people are doing practices, to be silent, to be respectful, those types of things can be important. And students may not think about those as guidelines, so it's okay to suggest them. And then after that, kind of setting the stage, doing welcome, introductions, kind of getting to know each other a little bit, is the first practice. And so what I'm going to do for these next couple, so I'll cover B, R, and E before turning it over to Doug, and we'll do one example practice for each of those, and the others we'll just kind of talk a little bit about. And this is one that we'll talk about today, and then you'll do tomorrow and have some opportunities to practice. And so this is an activity in mindful listening, but what's really important is that you don't tell participants that right away. And so the way that you start is that we're going to do our first practice together. It's always important to do this as a group practice and all together and talk about it. And students are just asked to sit comfortably with their eyes closed or resting on the ground ahead of them until the facilitator rings the bell. And you give them a minute or so to do this. And then you ask students what they heard. So you give them no instruction about the fact that they're supposed to be hearing things. You just ask them to sit and then they list what they can hear. And then you do it again. Except this time you add on the instruction that I want you to really pay attention to what you're listening to. You give them about the same amount of time and then again make a list on the board. And then use the discussion with questions like, what do you notice about how many things did you hear that first time versus how many things did you hear the second time? Usually the second time there's a lot longer list. And what's the difference between those two? Why did you notice more things? Using the discussion to get them to the three main elements of mindfulness. So this is a good example of where previous group work can be really helpful to guide the discussion to get people to a place where it leads you to the definition of mindfulness that you then put up on the board, that it's on purpose. So usually one of the first things people say is, well, I was directing my attention to sound. They may not use those words, but I was motivated, I was focused. So, well, that's a key element of mindfulness, that it's on purpose. And often we'll say, well, I was much more focused on what was happening right now that second time. That first time, my mind was all over the place because you didn't give me any instructions. And bringing that to the element of mindfulness is being present. So it's on purpose and present, focused on what's happening right now. Sometimes what takes a little bit more guidance is the third piece of the mindful attention definition of non-judgmental or curious. And so you can ask questions like, did you notice yourself reacting to a sound or judging sound, saying, oh, I don't like that, I do like that. And talking about how we often have an inclination to do that, but that a really key part of mindful attention is approaching everything that you encounter with curiosity and with non-judgment. And so being open to all sounds without preference. So that often takes a little bit more guidance to kind of get them to that idea, but try and get the discussion again to lead them to that, that definition rather of mindfulness. And then what often comes out of that is a discussion of the idea that we tend to practice mindlessness, so that we're very well versed in going through life on autopilot or automatic pilot. So a good time to introduce that phrase. The idea that we can be doing things without awareness, certainly without full awareness, doing things mindlessly, walking from place to place, for instance, and you get there and you're like, oh, I have no idea what I saw or heard. So introducing that idea of automatic pilot as a way, again, to underscore that we're good at doing things mindlessly. And so it's really good then, in contrast, to practice mindfulness, and that's what we'll do together and encourage them to do outside. And this next activity can be done either as a group or have people do it one-on-one or solo. Either of those is fine, but definitely some discussion about it is really helpful at the end. And you ask people, like the prompt here, is to think of things that they tend to do mindfully. So what do they do fully engaged, really aware of what they're doing, paying attention to things as they're happening? And what do they do mindlessly? On autopilot, not really paying attention. And you want to get some examples from students. And what's really helpful, this has happened every time we have done it, but if it doesn't happen organically, to kind of guide students in the direction of making sure that there are examples that show up on both lists. Whether because one person says, well, I drive mindfully, and another one says, I drive mindlessly, or people say, well, sometimes I do it one way and sometimes I do it the other way. So you want to get to a point where you have some things that are on both lists, and then ask them to, one, it can be helpful again, especially if there's a big difference. Sometimes the mindless list is quite a bit longer than the mindful list. That can be helpful to direct discussion towards. But to get them to think about why are some things on both lists and what characterizes the difference between them, bringing them to the idea that it's the quality of attention, that we can do, it's nothing inherent to driving or listening to music or cooking or whatever it is, that it's the quality of our attention when we're engaged in it, and that we can do things mindlessly or mindfully. Any questions about these kind of first few foundational practices before we will do the next one together as a group? All right. So for this next, we're gonna do this practice as a group similarly to what you would facilitate if you were facilitating the program, as one of the first kind of formal focused attention practices. So if you kind of wanna set your stuff down, move away, and I'm gonna lead you through this. So you wanna sit comfortably in your chair. You can keep your eyes open for now. You may decide to close them later or direct your gaze down. But for now, you'll keep your eyes open. Some of you may have done this practice before. If you have, I encourage you to approach it if you've never done it before and see if something different happens. And I'm gonna come around and I'm gonna place an object in your hand, so if you could hold your hand out. And I want you to imagine that you've never seen this object before. So imagine you've come, say, to this world for the first time and you've discovered this object and you don't really know what it is that you're encountering. So don't do anything in it yet. I'll lead you through some things in a moment. That was a demonstration. When you were leading it, that's something to avoid. It's a good idea as a facilitator, as a trainer, to make sure, to give you examples of things not to do. All right, so you have in your hand this object that you've never seen or encountered before. And I'd like you to draw your attention now to really exploring, understanding this object. What it looks like, what it feels like, what's the shape? Is it crunchy? Is it soft? What about the temperature? Is it cold? Is it warm? You can also, as some of you have started to do, what does it smell like? And I encourage you, when you do things like bringing it towards your nose, pay attention to the movement of your arm and your hand, taking the reason to your nose. What about sound? Does this object make a sound? What does that sound like? And as you're exploring this object, if you notice yourself having thoughts like, this is silly, why are we doing this? Just try and bring your attention back to the object, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it sounds like. And when you're ready, you can place the object in your mouth without chewing it or swallowing it. Just let it rest on your tongue. And pay attention to the sensations. What is it like to have this object on your tongue? And then when you're ready, consciously and thoughtfully, try taking a bite. And what are the sensations that you notice when you take a bite of this object? You can move it around. Do you notice anything different if you do that? And when you're ready, you can allow yourself to swallow this object. So what did you notice when you were holding that object in your hand? What were some things and features of that object that you noticed?
Dark color.
Their color.
It was light.
It wasn't dense or heavy.
Felt kind of rubbery. The wrinkles.
Very clean and smooth. Anything else? What about when you smelled it or you listened to it? What did you notice? Smoke and sweet. Did anybody hear anything?
I kind of like flicked it and it also sounded like some sort of like rubber door stopper or something.
Yeah.
Not very pleasant.
So if you manipulated it in
Yeah.
a particular way, so if you just held it, maybe no sound, but if you
Yeah.
moved it, it produced some sound. And is this how we normally eat? Does anybody eat this way? So you just ate, you took like a minute to eat a raisin? And
All the
okay.
time.
Yeah. So not the way that we normally eat. What made this mindful eating, the way that you ate that object?
We were paying attention on purpose.
Paying attention on purpose, so you're really directing your attention, which the fact that you were directing it to something that you're holding in your hand right now made it also present focused. What about, were there any judgments that you noticed pop up when you were exploring your object? Or did you approach it with curiosity?
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I didn't really want to eat it. I was like, this doesn't feel like food now. So that judgment of like, it seemed unappetizing.
Well, and if you didn't know it was a food, that might not be your first instinct to put it in your mouth. Like instruction, knowing, of course, it's edible, you bring in, you were gonna.
Sometimes I don't like the taste of raisins, and so when we've been to it, but you know, like letting that come and focusing on like how it feels with my teeth.
And trying to be open to that, you probably have encountered a raisin before, so you maybe knew you might have that response, but trying to be open to maybe today it'll be different. And that sometimes happens with program participants will say, I thought I hated raisins. And then I took a bite and I was like, well, I don't love it, but like that's not as bad. So like there can be some new things that are learned through this non-judgment. And where was your attention? So that was kind of shorter than we might do in a full learning to read program, but where was your attention during that practice? Did it wander at all?
I like almost dropped it once and then I laughed at myself and was really distracted, but then I went back to the reason.
And again, the important part of the mindfulness practice is bringing it back. So okay to, if there's the distraction, what's the important part of the practice is just working on bringing it back anytime that those distractions happen, which will be, especially with the longer practices as you go, much more likely to happen than in short ones like this. And so this is the type of discussion that you often have after this first mindful practice together. And often ending with a discussion of how could you eat more mindfully? How could you incorporate practices like this into your daily life? So we're going to turn back to talking a little bit about some of the next programs that go after this, and that can also be an alternative to it. So instead of mindful eating raisins, it's fine to present other options like Hershey's Kisses or clementines, a variety of different dried fruits. You can also give people a variety of choices of foods to eat, to all engage in a similar process of noticing the food before you put it in your mouth, the feel, the look, the smell, the hearing, and then put it in your mouth and kind of slowly eating it before swallowing it. But then there is also a similar activity that it does not involve eating that can be very fun and interesting to do as well, called Sense Doors. And the idea here is a facilitator to gather and present to participants a variety of objects and to practice sensory awareness without eating. And so using similar ideas to encourage people to notice, to be curious, to focus their whole attention on what they're doing, to notice their thoughts and then bring their attention back to the object. And really any object can be used. So all objects have mass, they have shape, they have smell or not, they have colors, they have temperature, so really any objects can be used, and it can be nice to have a variety of them, like bells, small toys, fabrics, jars of spices, so things that will kind of elicit different responses. And so walking through a very similar type practice to what we just did, but with feeling, smelling, hearing without the actual eating. Another optional practice And this is particularly helpful if it can be in an open area, in a nature area, but it doesn't have to be, is something called the mindful walkabout. And so this is when, as a group, you're taken to ideally a location in nature and asked to walk about mindfully and kind of experience what's in the setting around you and notice the natural world. And the kind of added layer is a recommendation that whenever somebody sees something new or of interest, they stop and mindfully observe it, similarly to with sense stores, but kind of based on what you encounter in the natural world. This can be appealing, in particular, the next part of, for some at least, to ask them to draw a map of kind of what they encounter along the way, or draw the objects that they see, or write a poem about it, and then share experiences with the whole group if they're interested. So this is another option. There are a lot of options, as you likely saw in the manual, to make some choices about kind of what works best given your setting or the interest of the group that you're working with, your time, things like that. So this kind of covers some of that intro stuff that happens in the first lesson, and the activities and discussion. And the next thing is that longer practice. And kind of underscoring the idea that as a group, we've been exploring how to pay attention in this special and particular way of mindfully through what we're listening to, what we eat, what we feel, what we hear. And now we're going to bring our attention to the body as a way to practice that special way of mindfully listening. And so the longer practice in the B session is a body scan. And there are several different versions in the manual to choose from depending on what works best. But what's really key, whichever one you use, is to really set this up with the idea that our mind can be in the present, but it can also be in the past or the future. But as a reminder that our body is always in the present. So our body is a really important anchor when we're trying to stay present focused. We can always bring our mind back to the body as a way to stay rooted in the present moment instead of being pulled to the past or looking forward to the future. And so tomorrow we'll do a formal body scan together, and you'll have some opportunities to practice that also. And what's really important, just like with the overall class, but before you do the body scan, is to pay very careful attention to the setup. And this is material, so making sure that you have yoga mats, if there's space for people to lie down, blankets in case people get cold, but also posture. And so as you'll see tomorrow, it's important for teachers to demonstrate good posture, what that might look like, similar to what these two teams are doing here, good posture during the body scan. And then also guiding their breathing. And so providing some formal instruction before the body scan about belly breathing, which is something we'll also do tomorrow. So this is a theme that we'll talk about as we go, but